welcome to Essex Wildlife Trust's 4th webinar now for our Urban Wildlife Champions and Wilder Communities project. I am Danielle Carbot, the Wilder Communities Manager at Essex Wildlife Trust, and lead the Urban Wildlife Champions and Next Door Nature projects. And it's great to see some familiar names on there and some new names as well. So yeah, just a reminder that if you are new, do send me an email so we can meet online or in person, whichever's easiest, so we can discuss your project and how the trust can help. To those familiar names, welcome back. Okay, so as I've said, yeah, thank you very much for joining this evening. And as usual, this is a webinar, so you'll not be able to turn your camera or microphone on. But if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. There's a little chat button at the top of your screen, and I will try and answer them at the end. Of course, you are also more than welcome to email me with questions if they pop up at a later date as well. Okay, so session 4 this evening will focus on the process of becoming a constituted voluntary group. This is a common structure for new groups who have plans for hopefully not obtaining charity status, purchasing projects, properties, or having staff, but looking at becoming a more structured voluntary group. So you may have the aim of searching for and receiving pots of funding. So although becoming constituted isn't suitable for every group or every project, it can be useful to those groups who want to create a structure, form a committee, open a bank account and obtain funding. So for many of you, becoming constituted will help you achieve those inspiring bat, swift, hedgehog, meadow or pond projects, whatever it might be. So yeah, it can seem like an overwhelming process. So today, hopefully, I will set out the key steps needed in order to achieve this. As a pre-warning, often discussions around becoming constituted are quite dry, but of course the reasoning behind that action is much more inspiring. So that is something to remember as we're going through the process today. You know, and as a community or a volunteer group, we forget how much power we actually have to affect change, and often becoming constituted within that, in many cases, can help bolster it. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the webinar and let's get into it. Okay, so first of all, before you even start looking at the process, with your current voluntary group or group of volunteers or interested locals, whatever sort of part of the process that you're at, make sure you defined why your group is needed. So have a look in your local area, research other local groups, see what they're doing, seeing if they're doing something similar or in fact the same thing. And I say this simply because it could be more beneficial to link up and add value to other groups rather than starting from scratch. And even if there are no other voluntary groups like the one you're hoping to set up, it really is important to make as many connections as you can. So it's always better to work together than in competition. The next thing which I've got on the screen here to think about is who else do you need to make this happen? No one can set up a constituted group by themselves, so reach out to other interested locals. I would highly recommend contacting your local CVS groups as well. So just got here the government website who have a list. There are a number in Essex, including those from Basildon, Billericay and Wickford. You've got Brentwood, Malden, Chelmsford, Colchester, Southend, Braintree and Tendring, plus Community 360, sorry. So I've just popped on there a few examples. I've also put on Castle Point, which is a slightly different group called CAVS. And we also have Volunteer Essex, where you'll be able to find further support and training opportunities there as well. So yeah, a few things to consider before you get going. Once you've had time to think about your group and how you might start, forming a committee is the first step to becoming constituted. So no matter how many people you have to begin with in your group or project team, to become constituted, you need to form a committee. Now, overall, you can decide on how big your committee is, but it must comprise of the following at least. So you've got to have a chair, vice chair, secretary and treasurer. And I will go into the specifics of these roles in the next slide. So the committee as an overall thing have the responsibility for meeting legal duties, giving direction to the group, taking on day-to-day decisions, ensuring the voluntary group is managed properly, financial management, ensuring actions are completed, and of course promoting good practice. So to achieve this, a committee must have at least one annual general meeting, which is often shortened to AGM. However, it is also suggested that committee meetings happen throughout the year. The amount can be decided by the committee itself, but on average that's around sort of 4 to 6 a year, so maybe every quarter, but of course it can be more. How a committee meets is also up for discussion. It can be online or in person, depending on what suits you and your space. I've known voluntary groups to meet sort of outside in their local, green patch, in a committee member's house, in a local cafe that they've hired out, or in a community centre. So the important thing here with forming a committee is that you make those structures before you think about who's going to be in the committee, you think about when you're meeting, and you think about your AGM. As a quick aside, an AGM, if you aren't familiar with it, is put in place to update all members of the voluntary group, to keep them informed, to elect or re-elect the committee, plus to share things like annual reports and annual accounts. And I will go over how to run an AGM later on in this webinar. So that is your first point of call, forming a committee. And personally, I think it's quite a fun part of the process, because you're looking at who you're going to be working with, who you're going to join forces with, and what sort of roles that you may need. So let's go into the specifics. I will go through chair, vice chair, secretary and treasurer in just a moment, but also at this point you will also need to decide on your legal structure. So that's either unincorporated or incorporated. And although it's possible to change this at a later date, it's best to do it right at the beginning. So let me first go through uncorporated, which I imagine is what most of you will choose. And it's simply a group of individuals working together. And for an unincorporated group, you don't need to register as a charity. So, you only need to register as a charity if your income is above £5,000. So it's unlikely that you'll need to or want to register as a charity. And there are many other voluntary groups in this category, the unincorporated category. It means that it's quick and cheap to set up with fewer complications. And the only downside of being unincorporated is that you are, you've got responsibility, you've got personal liability for the voluntary group, and it doesn't exist in its own entity, in its own right. So this type of constituted voluntary group is the one I'll be covering today, but for further information, you can also become incorporated, where your voluntary group exists as a legal entity from the individuals belonging to it, such as sort of CIC groups, so community interest companies, or CIO, charitable incorporated organisations. But for now, I will not be going into further detail on incorporated voluntary groups, because I think in most cases the unincorporated is going to be the most beneficial. So the key roles, there's 4 key roles needed within a committee that I previously mentioned. So the first is a chairperson. And in most cases, this chairperson will have been elected or appointed by the committee or volunteer members. And they lead the voluntary group through a number of actions. They will have a clear understanding of the voluntary group's aims and its work. So a good chairperson really is sort of a facilitator, ensuring positive discussions and involving all the groups. So they will do things like conduct meetings, including the AGM. They'll ensure decisions are taken and agreed at meetings. They'll provide space where applicable for voting, when that needs to happen. They'll ensure actions that have been decided are allocated to the appropriate person. They'll make final decisions on behalf of the committee, and of course also support members of the voluntary group. I've also added a vice chair. Although this is not compulsory, I think it's a really good idea to have one, because it complements the role of the chairperson. So it's a supporting role and will help the chairperson organise meetings and any other relevant events. And again, as a vice chair, they should have clear understandings of the voluntary group's aims and its work. Another really important role within the committee is the secretary. This role deals with the admin side of the committee and should have good organisational skills. So they'll deal with things like correspondence, they'll be checking attendance to committee meetings and AGMs, setting and sending out agendas, they'll take minutes and ensure accurate recordings of meetings are kept, and also send notice of AGMs. A treasurer, the last one there on my sort of essential list of positions, is also key to a committee, particularly because becoming constituted is vital to accessing funding. It can be sometimes a little tricky to find a treasurer, so in some cases it may be beneficial to contact your local volunteer centre or CVS, as I've mentioned earlier in the webinar, who may be able to help you recruit a volunteer with those specific skills in order to assist you. But overall, they'll be responsible for the financial management of the voluntary group. So they'll do things like ensure finances are conducted within the legal requirements and good practice, share financial reports with the committee, deal with budget management, which includes things like banking and record keeping, and support with obtained funding and fundraising. There are, of course, many other positions within the committee that may be included, such as a communications lead for things like if you want to develop a website or have newsletters for your members, or perhaps even someone that can be there for things like radio appearances. Or perhaps you want a role such as a fundraiser for the organisation who can be in charge of pulling together those events, or specific challenges or things that help to raise money. So the options really are limitless, but further roles should only be used if applicable to your project, volunteer aims or space. Okay, so that's sort of the first two steps there, forming the committee and making sure you have the correct roles within that committee. So once it's been formed with those roles, it's time to consider a constitution, which essentially is a set of rules that becomes your governing document to ensure decisions are made in a democratic way. And just in case you see it somewhere else, it can also be called a terms of reference. It also tells potential funders how you conduct your business and what your group hope to achieve. So many funders will ask to see this before awarding you any funding. So it's a really important part of creating a community group and making sure that you are constituted. Now, there are many templates that you can use, and I would highly recommend Parks Communities template, and I will go into further detail around helpful websites and documents at the end of the session, but it should cover these main points. So I've just listed them there so you can see them for yourselves. I'm just going to go through each one and give you a bit of an overview of what that means. So number one, nice and easy, hopefully, the name of the voluntary group. And just as an aside, the name of the voluntary group also needs to be the same name that you give the bank account when you open one, if you open one, just to ensure that there's no confusion there, because otherwise funding could be hard to gain. Maybe they won't, pay into your bank account. So it's really important to make sure that you've agreed on a suitable name that's going to be used in all different situations. Number two, so a really important part, and it should be something you're thinking about before you even write this document, but it's the objectives and aims of the voluntary group that you've created. So these should be discussed and decided by the members that you've already got in the voluntary group, and aims should be the more broad, general, long-lasting goals. And the objectives should be more sort of specific, shorter term targets, which should be reviewed frequently. So, for example, your overall aim may be to enhance the biodiversity on your local green space, whereas your objective, one of your objectives, may be focused on more sort of specific practical management, such as the creation of grassland habitat through cut and collect, or it could be revolved around something like community development, such as working and involving local residents to enhance the biodiversity of your local green space. So that's a really important part of the Constitution, and it gives you that aim and also that long-term planning to look at what you want to achieve, where you're going as a voluntary group, and sort of the aims and objectives as you move through those stages. Okay, so Number 3, powers the committee may exercise. So in short, these are the powers needed to further the above aims through various actions. So this could be things like the committee have power to raise funds, hold meetings, publicise activities, obtain advice from experts, liaise with local council, or even bring together representatives and so on. So it's just looking at some of those things that the committee will be looking to do to achieve the overall aims of the voluntary group. You've then got number 4, which is sort of membership criteria. So in most cases, for many of you on here today, your voluntary group will be open to all persons in sympathy of the group's aims. But within your constitution, you need to be able to show that. You should also be able to show that membership is non-party political and non-sectarian and committed to sort of non-discriminatory practices and equal opportunities. So it's quite an important part, particularly for funders, to show your membership criteria and who's involved in your voluntary group. You should also highlight within that each member will have a vote and be eligible to stand for election onto the committee. Furthermore, in order to really truly represent the local community, the area that you're working in, it's probably a good idea to also have an equal opportunity statement of intent. And that could be things where you consider how you ensure events, committee meetings, or other group tasks that are relevant to your aims are flexible enough to meet the needs of various individuals and of all individuals. Larger, more established groups could also consider creating an objective to improve equality of the representation in the committee itself. So I think number 4 there is a really important part of your constitution. Okay, so number 5, code of conduct. Now this is an optional part of this document, but it's a good one to add because it aims to outline sort of acceptable behaviour and principles for members to agree to. Nice and easy. You've then got number 6, management of committee. This details how the committee is set out. So it includes things like the number of committee members, the roles within that committee, and how they will direct the policy and management of the volunteer group. You've then got number 7, meeting procedures. Within here as well, you need to say the number of general meetings that are held each year. As I said, on average, they're sort of 4 to 6, but this needs to be outlined. And then also the process and criteria of the AGM, which again, I will go over later in the webinar. You've then got number 8, finances. So within this part of the document, it will focus on how received funding or any money raised should be used to further the end sort of aims of the group. Things like details of the bank account to be open should be in there, and those whose signatures would be required for checks, if that's applicable, that needs to be included. So a simple written note on the group's financial position is also really beneficial if there is one, and of course, if as you're beginning up, it might be looking at your hopes for your financial position, where you're looking at getting funding, and also things that are produced at general meetings and AGMs further down the line. So really sort of giving an insight into your financial position. It would also be beneficial to have like a statement highlighting that no member shall derive any financial benefit from that group, just to really show that it is a voluntary group and not a business. So that's a really helpful part of the document. You've also got number 9, which is alterations of the Constitution. So just a quick note really on the fact that the Constitution can be amended when necessary. It's also essential when that is done, that members are informed and given an opportunity to consider and vote on any amendments that are made. And that normally happens within an AGM, but it's just good to give a sort of outline that that is expected or that can happen. And then the last one, dissolution. So again, a quick note in the document to emphasise that if deemed advisable, the group can dissolve, and things like at least 14 days notice will be given to members of the group if that does happen. So that's the sort of ins and the outs of creating that document. And as I said, there are plenty of templates out there, so please don't feel that you have to write that from scratch. There are some really wonderful examples out there. There are some quite intense examples on the government website that I can send through to if you'd want a more in-depth sort of idea of what that might look like. But as I said, the Parks Communities template, and I will show you the link to that later on in the webinar, is a really good one to use. And yeah, after this point, you're pretty much ready to go. You're ready to start running your group. So it's a really good stage to get to, because you can start thinking about where you're going to move to next. So I'm just going to give you an outline of some other things that you'll need to make sure that you cover after your constitution is written. So next one here is looking at bank accounts. So as I said, in order to receive funding, donations or grants, you need to open a bank account in your group's name. And I was having a look at, again, Parks Communities Twitter, and there was a chat back in June 2020 where lots of different groups from across the UK were talking about the various banks that were favoured, and there was a short list that was put forward. So I've just popped on there some of the banks that were shortlisted and it emerged from, you know, discussions from various volunteer groups. So they were Unity Trust Bank, the CAF Bank, the Cooperative Bank, Tide, Lloyds and Monzo. So they might be good places to start. Now I know obviously 2020 was a slightly different year and we've moved on from there, but they might be good starting points for you. Once you've decided on the bank that you're going to use, most banks require proof that your group is voluntary, so not a private business, as I've already said. This could be in the form of a letter from your chair or secretary, could be a copy of minutes at your first meeting, authorising your group to open a bank account, or it could be a copy of your group's constitution. It could be any of those documents. Sometimes banks want to see all three, but make sure when you are choosing your bank that you are opening it and it's listed as free banking, so no day-to-day charges unless specified. To note as well, sometimes banks also refer to voluntary groups as clubs or societies, so just something to be aware of. Now, banks are very familiar with this process, and you can open a bank account by going into your local branch and filling out any relevant forms. It's also possible to do online applications, but it can take a while for bank accounts to be set up. So it really is recommended to do this as early as possible. Banks will tend to score or look into individuals on the application, and they can go back sort of as far as 6 years. So it's really good to get that process going and thinking about who is, you know, the individuals that you're putting on the application, making sure that they're within your committee. If your voluntary group is writing checks, or you think they might write checks in the future, as I mentioned earlier for this, that you need 2 or more named signatories. That's what's needed. So one of the things we advise is making sure that the signatories are not related. So this can sometimes put funders off, and the bank will require identity of each signatory, and usually it's necessary them to go in person to the branch. So yeah, just something to note about, you know, if you're going to go down the check process. But yeah, once you've opened a bank or you've started that process, another really good thing to do is drawing up a budget. So really is a key step to becoming constituted, and it should be happening each year. So the voluntary group and the committee within that should come up with a realistic financial plan. So it will set out any expected received funding, any expected donation or grants as income. Also it needs to look at any estimated expenditure such as insurance, rent or room hire, equipment, or any other perceived needs such as printing costs. Some items might even be specific to your voluntary group and should be added into the budget as well. So a really important step, and it's a really handy step as well, looking at your sort of yearly plan, because budgets usually cover a 1-year period, so it gives you that opportunity to plan ahead, thinking about maybe the events that you might want to hold, thinking about the actions or the tasks that you might maybe want to move forward with, or, you know, potentially looking at what funding you need to achieve certain aims in your voluntary group. Okay, so Other documents that you might need to think about that I won't go into detail today, but should be thought about, include things like health and safety procedures, safeguarding policies, data protection, any GDPR policies, plus other board policies like conflict of interest and expenses. And again, very similar to the Constitution document, there are a number of templates and models out there, so don't write these from scratch. It's also worth thinking as well when you're making a budget, you know, insurance, specifically public liability insurance, thinking about whether you need that and where you might get it from. You also would need insurance for any tools or equipment that you might use. Alongside this, risk assessments are also needed for any work within the public or if your volunteers are taking part in any practical tasks. So that should come in really with your budget talk and probably in your first sort of committee meeting and where you're looking to go and what policies and procedures you need to get in place. Okay, as I said, AGM, just a quick look at AGMs and how they run. I mentioned that I'd briefly cover this. So every organisation must hold an annual general meeting. Some of you have most likely already attended one yourself. The purpose for an AGM is to review the past year's activities. So it's things like considering the financial situation, electing new committee members or re-electing committee members for the following year, and making any necessary changes to the Constitution. If possible, AGM should happen around the same time each year because they're looking back at the year. So it's good to keep them as continuous as possible in the same time each year. So first of all, let's have a look at preparation for an AGM. The secretary of the committee should remind your voluntary group that nominations sort of around 6 to 8 weeks in advance are due for the next year's committee members. As mentioned, there may be new people standing for a committee position, or there may be people looking to be re-elected. Obviously, in your first AGM or general meeting, it will be about looking at your first roles within that committee. The secretary should also be asking for other matters that are not included in the usual stated business of the meeting, asking people to email those through so they can be added to the agenda. And the AGM's date should be sent out to all members of the volunteer group well in advance. So it's usually suggested sort of around 14 to 21 days before the meeting to ensure as many people as possible can attend. This is also mentioned in your Constitution when you outline those meeting procedures. So you need to make sure that you pop that in that document as well. For the AGM itself, some of you may be wondering sort of what a usual agenda might be, and although these are fairly unique to the volunteer group in question, there are a few standard elements that I can just go through to give you an idea. So to begin an AGM, there should be opening remarks or maybe just a quick welcome from the chair, plus apologies for any absences, because you can do it as in advance the date as you can, but I'm sure there'll always be people that can't attend. And then before you go into the meeting itself, you need to look at the minutes from the last AGM. They should be discussed with any matters arising, a report of any action taken following a decision at the last AGM. There should also be a chair's report, secretary's report, treasurer's report, all included in the AGM. And once you've gone through those steps, elections can then take place. So as I said, either to elect new committee members or to re-elect. And for most voluntary groups, a show of hands is the easiest way of electing committee members. Amendments to the Constitution should also be considered within the AGM. So although this is not mandatory that any changes are made, any amendments that are made should be voted on. It's up to the committee to decide on what the majority is needed to carry a decision, who can vote and how they vote. And again, as I said, this should be laid out in the Constitution as mentioned before. And then obviously finally within an AGM, there should be a chance for any other business. So an opportunity for members of the volunteer group to air their views and suggest future activities or just to share current activities. A true record of minutes should be taken by the secretary at an AGM, which all members of the voluntary group should be able to access. Another nice addition to AGMs are awards. So an acknowledgement of commitment, good practice, specialised support, or achievements that relate specifically to your aims and objectives. So that's sort of a general gist of how an AGM might look and how you might run it. But of course, there's some other things that you may want to add to make it more specific to your group. So I've sort of gone over all the major elements in your journey to becoming constituted, but to bring it all together, I've just popped it on a sort of more simplified step diagram here, and it just goes over what we've covered. So the first one was form a committee. The second one there was ensure your committee agrees on a constitution, so creating that document. Then obviously the next step is opening a bank account. Then you need to discuss budgets and any insurance requirements and any extra policies and procedures that should be in place. And then you can start applying for funding. And of course, there's also that added extra of having your annual general meeting. So that is the general idea of how to become constituted. And I do know that's a very sort of whistle-stop tour, and you probably have lots of questions bouncing around. So for further guidance and step-by-step guides and resources, there are some fantastic websites out there. As I said, my first recommendation is Parks Community, that middle logo there. They promote and help to embed community empowerment in the management of green spaces throughout the UK. So it's sort of like a one-stop shop for all information, and that information is actually also compiled by lots of different friends or groups across the UK, so a really handy space. You've also got the umbrella website, which is the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces, also really useful. They sort of aim to amplify the voices of different voluntary groups across the UK. I think they've got something like 6,000 local friends of groups within that federation. Another recommendation, particularly if you were working with children or teenagers or youth groups, you've got Fields in Trust. They've partnered with Green Space Charity, Groundwork, you might have heard of those before, and the National Youth Agency and Future Proof Parks. And they've got multiple guides containing sort of advice for groups working with young people. You've then got a more localised website that I've just popped on there, SAVS, which is Southend Association of Voluntary Services, also really useful. They have fantastic step-by-step guides on how to become constituted, which is very similar to the webinar that I've just shared with you today. And as mentioned before, you've also got your local CVS groups across the county. So do go on there, see what toolkits they've got or any training that they might have on offer. And then you've also got at the top there another really excellent guide created by Green Space Urban Parks Forum, and it looks at how to set up and maintain a community group for parks and green spaces. So another really good one to look out for. So if you need any of the links because you can't find them, please let me know. I can email those across. But yeah, now we can move on to another part of our webinar today. Enough of me talking. We're moving on to funding. So this evening we've got James Astley, our awesome grants and trust officer, who has kindly agreed to share some of his top tips for successful funding applications. So over to you, James.
Hello, thank you very much. Yes, I'm James. I am the Grants and Trust fundraiser at ACS World Life, responsible for raising funds for applications to various trusts and foundations, charitable, statutory and other. I'm going to give a quick overview about what might go into an approach to a funder and how you might find funders and some of the things you might consider when approaching, when you're writing these approaches, basically. I'm happy to help out or answer any questions that anybody has. If you'd like to reach out to me after this through Danielle, that's not a problem at all. So what should go into an approach for funding? Well, I once went on a training course where the guy delivering it distilled what went into a funding bid into 4 pretty basic headings, and it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but I've always found it to be quite a good place to start. And he basically said, and this probably could have summed up his whole training course, set out the need you're addressing, so why you're going to do it, explain what you're going to do to address that need, how much that will cost, and then how you know you've met that need. And that's not a comprehensive list of things to include, certainly not a chapter list or a heading to write underneath. But if you clearly explain those things to the right funder, and while doing so, establish that your project is feasible, fundable, ready to deliver, that you're capable of doing it, you're off to a good start. So we'll go through those 4 sort of headings, ingredients, one by one, a bit later on. But first, just mention some sort of key language that I'll probably go back to around outcome and impact, and what the difference is, and then briefly talk about what might be a proportional or an appropriate amount to write in a document, how much you should be writing on an approach for funding. Outcome and impact. So there's a lot of ways to discuss this and to describe it. Output, outcome, deliverable, impact, they often get interchanged as well. I tend to use outcome and impact, just the first ones that I was told years ago, where the outcome is the thing that you do and the impact is the difference that it makes. So as an outcome, as an example, an outcome or a deliverable in your project might be planting 500 meters of hedging. That's the thing that was done. It's obviously a good thing too, but what does it actually mean to have planted those trees? What difference does it make? And that difference is the impact of your deliverable project work. And in this example, it might be that your new hedge leads to the creation or connection of habitat. It could be that the impact is the establishment of a boundary, or training of people to plant the trees, or building community relationships. These impacts are why you bother to do the outcome, and there's obviously not just one impact per deliverable. The best outcomes will deliver multiple impacts. In terms of proportionality and size, so I obviously don't know what projects you'll be applying for, and maybe not all of you do yet either, or what they're going to cost therefore, but it's likely perhaps to be relatively small amounts, and it's therefore important to go into this not looking to write a 30-40 page bid with appendices and professionally designed layouts. Equally, if you are going for big money and you write 2 sides, you might not be successful. So in a past life, I assessed applications for fairly simple projects, ranging from a few £100s to a few £1,000s, and some applications were in total 6 sentences long. These were not successful applications. Often a funder will tell you how much they need. Mostly they won't. Generally speaking, I would think that 2 or 3 sides is more than plenty, with some key appendices where necessary. Don't put yourself through the extra work or the assessor. It's just going to irritate them and it won't help, in my opinion. So those 4 headings. First, set out the need you're addressing. Why are you bothering to do this? What need have you identified that you want to meet? It might be simple as that wildflower meadows have declined nationally and there are no wildflowers, and you'd like to create some meadow habitat. It might be that there are meadows locally, but you think there should be more, or one in your area. Whatever, funders give money because they want to see changes that they're interested in seeing, and they'll need you to explain that in the application form. You need to be clear that you understand why you're doing your project. Most funders will give a clear idea on the needs that they're interested in addressing. Some are really explicit, have a whole, a really clear policy agenda that they're looking to deliver through giving these funds out. Others don't say anything at all. Whatever the case is there, it's when you're writing your approach, it's key that you seek to understand the funder and the difference that they're trying to see in the world, why they are spending money on your projects. So try to understand them. And once you do this, you can then be specific about what you're writing to each funder when you're setting out your need. Or setting up the need that you're looking to address, rather. For example, in our village, I am part of a group angling for an avenue of local varieties of fruit trees along the recreation ground, along a pathway. It's a really simple thing, surprisingly contentious in some quarters, but a really simple thing. But it appeals very differently to different funders, different potential funders, of which there are a few locally. And accordingly, when the time comes to make those applications, we're going to set out that need for our project in a very different way. I mean, to some that are interested in habitat loss and fragmentation, species decline, we'll talk about how the trees are vital habitat. To others, they're more interested in the local varieties of fruit trees, the kind of heritage aspect of it and the cultural side. To others, it's a visual contribution to place or community, the opportunity for young people. There are even some people who might contribute who I believe are most interested in the fact that the trees might shield a view of the play area. Whatever the need is, the outcome, the deliverable outcome that we're doing won't be changing. We're still putting trees in the ground. It's just about how you sell that project to the funder. So understand the funder, where they're coming from, and write to them as an individual. Try and evidence your need if you can. And without evidence, your statement of need is kind of an assertion of need. It's not quite as powerful. And evidence can take many, many forms. Published data, statistics at local, regional, national scale, anecdotal evidence, quotes from local people or other bodies, consultations, research papers, case studies, focus groups, policy agendas belong to councils and conservation charities and whatever else. And ideally, you'll provide a mix of evidence types as they support each other, I think. So, a nationally published statistic is verifiable, Take the 97% decline in wildflower meadows nationally, for example. Just as you can look that up, so can the funder. It's a provable piece of document that's based on evidence that's out there, but it's not necessarily directly related to your project and your community and your area. So while it's strong in one way, it's quite weak in another. And so at the opposite end of the data, you might have something you've gathered yourself through surveying and consulting the community. This is not verifiable by the funder, but is absolutely clearly directly linked back to you and your project and your proposal and your community. So use a mix. They complement each other. We found a lot of success in previous community projects I've been involved in our community with generating data, basically, making our own, going out to the community and writing consultations and questions, and holding a little stall in the village centre on the market day. And these were really helpful to not just show that our community consented and supported our proposals, but it also helped us to establish some baselines that we could then measure against when we came back to reporting our success, which is the fourth of the 4 headings. So heading number 2, what are you going to do to address the need that you've set out? It's a fairly simple heading. This is what you're going to do with the funders' money. How are you going to spend it? So it's your outcomes, your deliverable work, and the impact that they're going to have. The key here, I think, is being explicit about linking your outcomes and your impact together, and then but also to the need. So there's this clear narrative chain. I understand why I'm doing this project. This is what I'm going to do, and this is how it addresses that need that I set out at the top. Make it easy for the funder to follow these links. The people who read this are people. They make mistakes, and if you're relying on them to dig through a huge piece of prose to find the scattered pieces of a narrative, they're going to miss things potentially. And I certainly have done when reading things in the past on the first pass. And so make it as easy as possible. And on that, don't stick to words. If you've got a project that is going to benefit from photos, images, plans, videos, produce those. A lot of people don't. It will help you to stand out from the crowd, and it will really help to kind of visualize and show that your project is something that you've really thought through and developed and planned out properly, and is therefore feasible. Funders like feasible, because it means they're not throwing good money after bad. Again, evidence. There will be evidence to support the benefits that your work is going to be delivering, so find it and cite it. Might even be other groups out there who've done the same thing as you. Probably will be, of course, and that's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's really good. We're not the first village to look at planting a community orchard, and you'd be absolutely sure that I'm going to talk about the ones and how successful they are in surrounding communities when the time comes to writing those applications. If your project is sufficiently complex or seasonal in nature and it would benefit from this, consider a project plan or like a Gantt chart or something which sets out what you're going to do and when. Again, it just not perhaps appropriate for everything, but it really does show that you've thought it through, you're organised and credible, and your project is feasible and deliverable, and you're at the point where it's ready to go. Third heading, explain how much your work's going to cost. So this is the budget. It's not quite the main thing, but it's pretty close. Again, understanding your funder is really key here. It's no point asking for 20 grand from a funder who never offers above 3. Similarly, it's no point asking for 3 from someone who only does 2 grants a year and they're £600,000 each. Just understand who you're writing to and asking for the right thing. With that said, ideally, you're going to ask for what you need. You're going to ask for how much money it is that you need. But if you are asking for less than your total project, it's really strong to be clear about where that remainder is coming from. Perhaps with a fundraising plan showing other bids that you've submitted, funding that's been committed to you, and perhaps bids you intend to make going forwards. I think another important part here goes back to understanding the funder you're applying to. Some will only want you to apply at the very late stage where you've maybe already received half of the money that you need. And they're not going to be the first funder in a multi-funder project. So again, try to understand and be clear about where the whole lot's coming from if you're asking for less than the full amount. As a key principle when writing a budget in a bid, I think they should be reassuring. That's the word that this trainer at the top used for me, and I thought it's a really good way of looking at it. Reassuring. Ideally, someone should be able to read the budget in isolation and understand what it is you're going to do and how you're going to fund it, and not be left with any niggling questions about content or feasibility. So if you're using an application form on a website or on a paper application form that a funder's produced, some of this is less relevant, but the principles are the same. Write it in a table. It almost goes without saying, but I have read budgets in a narrative form, and they're really hard to follow and really, really irritating. A table at its most basic with a column for the item to be funded, how much it's going to cost, and the narrative as to why you need it, and crucially, how it relates back to the outcomes you intended to deliver that you've set up further up the application form. Again, sort of make that narrative journey throughout the application form, make it as easy as possible to follow. So as I said, link each item back to a deliverable outcome, and then in turn the impact. It's just really, really assuring. So you know exactly why you're going to buy so many grams of wildflower seeds at so many pounds each to create this area of habitat. You know exactly why you need that in the budget because you've mentioned it further up. Don't surprise them with something that's not in the budget. So in our fruit and tree projects, if we started asking for wildflower seeds and hadn't talked about it further up, that's not reassuring and undermines us hugely. Make sure it adds up. Again, really, really simple and obvious, but my last job where I assessed applications, I read so many that did not add up. Despite even producing an online form where you just typed in the numbers, it still didn't add up. And these people did not get the funding. Not every funder is going to come back to you and ask you to have another go and see if you can get this right a second time round. So, I mean, there's nothing less reassuring than reading a budget and coming away thinking, how have they got to that number? So take your time, get it right on the amounts. Some sort of final thoughts on budgets, really. Give it the time it needs. I've both assessed and written bids where it was clearly an afterthought or put together poorly, and they were not successful bids. So give it the time it needs. If you need to include quotes from contractors or companies or whatever else, make sure you've got them. And again, link them to items in the budget and deliverables. Make sure it's clear why you have that quote. Include copies of the quote, perhaps, as an appendices. And finally, VAT. I'm not sure whether this is going to be particularly relevant. I think it's probably worth a quick note. It's often a sticking point because it's confusing, understandably. The core thing is here, if your organisation can reclaim VAT, such as a charity, the funder's not going to give you VAT as part of their grant. So, because you'll just claim it back and you're double dipping, basically. They're funding something which you don't need funded. In that case, therefore, appropriate lines in your project budget, which are VAT applicable, such as capital expenditure, make sure that the prices in your budget table are VAT exclusive and make it clear in your calculations. You might need various columns. So, you know, an ex-VAT column for the cost of an item, a VAT column, and some, you know, totals, whatever you do with it, make it clear if that is applicable to you, that you understand where you sit with VAT. Fourth heading, explain how you're going to measure success, how you've met the need. This will be different for every project, every applicant, and perhaps even different to different funders for the same project. As I said, we're going to, when we do apply for our community orchard, we're going to be stating a different need to various funders, and therefore when we come back to measure our success, when we say in the application how we're going to do that, it will be different each time based on the need that we set out, the argument that we've made. You can always talk to funders ahead of a bid and ask what they might want to see by way of monitoring, because obviously they might have their own goals, that they've got their own change they want to see in the world. They want to promote their work. Potentially they might have things that they need or that they find really useful. So talk to them, say, you know, we've got this project, it's clearly beneficial. Ask the question, what do you think we should include by way of monitoring evaluation? There may also be guidance documents when you make the application, which make this kind of stuff really clear, or at least you can read between the lines and work out what you should be doing here. It's worth stating that you should be very, very careful not to overpromise. So our fruit trees plan is obviously going to benefit insect populations, but it's just not possible or feasible for our little community group to go and demonstrate an impact on insect populations locally. So we shouldn't promise that to a funder in our application, because, you know, if they pick up on the fact that it's unrealistic, and they probably will, that makes us look less feasible, less developed, less intelligent, I suppose. And at the worst, it could leave us in a really sticky situation later on when we can't deliver the promises that we've said. So be careful that you're writing in your bid sort of success measurements that you can actually deliver. In a lot of cases, it's likely to be fairly binary, a fairly basic condition. I mean, either the trees have been planted or they have not. Support that with some statements, some pictures of bees, some pictures of the trees. But whatever you use, make it clear at the application stage that you know what success looks like and how you're going to measure it, and that it relates to the outcomes and impacts and your need set out in your bid. This is not an afterthought moment. This is something that should be sort of baked into the bid from the outset. It might even be that you establish your own baseline data before you make the application. As I said just a minute ago, we had great success with the last community project that I was involved with by going to the community and asking various questions, knowing full well that we could then establish a baseline of those questions and come back to them later on and say, we know that we've been successful because we've made so much progress on these data which we established at the beginning of the process. Again, just be creative with your format as a final note on that. If you are able to promise images and videos, do so. Again, very popular with funders because it's obviously stuff that they can reuse themselves at a later date. So those 4 headings don't really cover it all, obviously. So there's some other sort of bits to bear in mind. This is a little bit scattergun, the next section. I've not really categorized these thoughts or arranged them into a narrative, but I hope they're useful. Funders are people and they're not out to get you. They're there to see a change in the world, and they don't want to assess an application which isn't going to meet their needs at all. So call them up, email them, speak to them, unless they clearly don't want it. Some funds are very difficult to contact, but mostly they're not like that. Call them up, talk to them, build a relationship, even before you submit the application. So when the application lands on their desk, they know who you are, what you're planning, and that you've got every chance of sending them what they want to see in terms of application content. Right, supporting documents. You can always submit extra stuff that doesn't fit on an application form by email. It makes you stand out slightly, I suppose. Don't go overboard by sending too much. But if you really feel like a Gantt chart's going to help the reader understand what it is that you're going to be doing, and there's no way to put it in the application form or whatever, dig out an email address and send it in. They're going to read it. It's probably not going to hinder your application. But as I say, don't go overboard about it. A really good first exercise, I think, when writing bids, and it's a really common question on application forms, is to explain your project in 1 sentence, in 20 words. What are you doing? Why does it matter? I've always thought it's quite difficult, if it's quite difficult to do that, to really explain an elevator pitch, what it is you're doing and why it matters. It might not be such a good of a project, or at the very least, if you can't explain it quickly, it's going to be really hard. You're going to have an uphill struggle to make a reader understand the benefits of your project if it's not something that's easily communicable. And if you are going to speak to funders on the phone, having that elevator pitch, sort of that boilerplate key statements worked out, is really, really useful. Your first impressions can be bad as well as good. I said it before, worth saying again, tailor your approach to the specific funder, read their guidance, look them up and the Charity Commission or wherever else, see who they funded before, look at their annual return, learn as much as you can, and then write to them as people. I mean, the core outcomes in your bids might be the same. Elements in your bids might be copied and pasted from bid to bid, from funder to funder. Sometimes even whole letters can be just topped and tailed and sent off again. But I think it's better to go to each approach to each funder, assuming you have to start from scratch based on who they are. So write to the specific audience, specific interests. Don't approach a wellbeing-based funder with a letter that's all about conservation. And similarly, don't approach a conservation-minded funder with a letter that only talks about wellbeing and community cohesion. Mention those things, by all means. Mention that their money is going to deliver more benefits than just they're interested in. But write to the right audience and don't focus on the wrong things. When you are writing, you can keep factual, don't waffle. But don't be afraid of weaving in emotion and telling stories. People do remember and respond to this. People are people, after all. Feasibility, I've mentioned this further up. Your application needs to make it clear that your proposal is feasible. And this is sort of many different angles. It needs to be well planned, well developed. If you need permissions and consents, have them in place before applying, and specifically mention that you've sought them out and got them. It all contributes to making you appear credible and your project appear feasible and deliverable, and that all it's missing is their bit of money. Low risk, basically. You want to be low risk. You want to reassure them that you can take their money and deliver change. Use the funder's language if you can. If you use deliverable and impact in your writing, but they write about output and outcome on theirs, use their words. Similarly, if they use key phrases in their guidance documents, a website or criteria or whatever, parrot their own language back at them, use their language. Again, make it as easy as possible for the funder to give you that money, as difficult as possible to refuse it. I've said this fell off as well. Use images, photos, plans, drawings. Again, memorable. A lot of people don't use them. It helps to show that you've planned things out, have a clear vision. Not suitable in every case, but use them where you can. Talk about partnerships you have with other groups in your community. People love partnership working. Again, it makes things more feasible. Understand that funders read a lot of applications. They can and will see through nonsense. So don't write any nonsense. And finally, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I mean, I'm not saying write poorly or make mistakes, but understand that yours does not need to be the best application in the pile. It needs to make a cut. It needs to make the top few, or however many they're going to fund. It needs to be good enough, not perfect. So make sure it's good enough, finish it off and send the next one, move on to the next one. Which brings me briefly on to finding funding. So competition is tight. There are more people than ever seeking less money than ever, but there are a variety of ways to find funding opportunities. There are big databases online of funding sources. Some are just lists, some are databases, other paid for services. Funds online, 360 Giving, grants online. Have a Google for sort of funding sources and they will crop up. These are excellent lists of potential funding opportunities, but beyond this, there are a useful starting point to dig deeper as well. So look at the funders and what they funded, but then look at the recipients as well. Look the recipients up, search online for them and other similar projects to your own, and where did they get their funding from? Go through projects and charities, annual reports, project reports, see if they list their funders, call them up, give them a ring. If you can find a contact, ask them. And similarly, look at interpretation boards and funder plugs at local projects. Dig a little bit beyond the list of people that can give you money. Look at people who've had money before that have done what you're already doing now. The Charity Commission can be a very hard website to search and browse because it's a bit rubbish, but ultimately it's a really, really important resource. Again, not just to find funders, but to look at the funders and their annual returns to the Commission, see what they've been funding, how much they've been funding, and who they've been funding. So again, then you can look up all those people that have received grants from whatever trust it is you're looking at, and look at their projects, how they frame them, but also where else they've got funding from. So just keep digging as deep as you can and follow all the threads as you can, because you might find yourself finding new opportunities. Similarly, look at trustees listed on the Charity Commission website. A lot of them have multiple trusteeships. Click through, see what else they're interested in, see if any of those are things that you could apply for. Your local councils are vital here. Some have grant schemes. County level, these can be quite significant amounts of money. Look at the same for your district council too, even right down to parish and town council, depending on where you are. That's quite bitty. There can be grants to be found. So talk to the councils, either your local councillor, your ward members, or council staff themselves. Our tree planting project, for example, our little community orchard, is already on the radar of sustainability officer at our district council because they saw a Facebook post we made and they've already reached out and asked if they can meet on site and talk it through and how they can help. So ask for direction, ask for help and direction to funds through your local council. District and county councillors have discretionary grant schemes for community projects, which they, in my experience locally, can struggle to spend or struggle to find projects for. So talk to them and ask them. The Essex Association of Local Councils, or on the council angle, as well as running their own micro grants scheme, have a list of funding sources and a funding officer, so someone who specifically looks after funding opportunities. The Rural Community Council for Essex, RCCE, are probably also worth a call as well. All these organisations have newsletters and circulars from the councils, from RCCE, ELC, all the rest of it, from the various local funding databases as well. Sign up, read them. Sign up, read them and follow them. They will give you information when it's required. And potentially there's also other people mentioned in those emails which you can contact and ask for advice. Seek local advice, talk to people, councillors, other projects. So, ask questions and go networking is an important thing here. That quite abruptly brings me to the end of what I've written, which is good because my voice is about to go. As I said, I'm more than happy to help out if anyone wants to get in touch via Danielle. Thank you and good luck with your projects.
Thank you so much, James. That was super helpful. Yeah, a massive insight into how to successfully apply for funding and the various elements that you need to consider. So I hope, everyone here at the webinar today has got some fantastic ideas to move forward. And then just as an extra, yeah, for those who need funding to achieve their sort of voluntary group aims and objectives, please keep an eye out for the Urban Wildlife Champions newsletters. These are sent out monthly, and alongside other various bits of information, always highlight either national or local pots of funding that are available or have popped up at that time. So it can be handy if you are struggling to find any, you know, sources of funding through all the various tips James has just given you there. So yeah, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much for coming along. I've checked the chat and it seems no one has had any questions as we've moved through the webinar, but I just wanted to check before we log off. Does anyone have any questions now? And if you do, there's a chat bubble just at the top along the line of your screen next to people and reactions. So just pop it in there if you have anything. And if not, yeah, I'll see you on the next webinar or in person and a workshop or site visit. And thank you very much.